Hey everybody, today's video is all the second part of chapter 3. It's all about the charter and how in a changing society our understanding of people's rights changes. So we're going to look at some cases where in the past, before we had the charter, where we discriminated against people in various ways. And then we're looking at ways that the charter helps to protect people's rights in today's society and make sure that things are in check in the workplace with the laws we pass and stuff like that. Before we go on though, I just want to mention the mustache is kind of weird and gross. We're in the middle of November, towards the end of November as I'm filming this. So we're part of a challenge here at my school. This is not going to age well on video. So for the people in the future seeing this, I'm sorry. There it is. Hey, enjoy the video. It's about 15 minutes or so long. We'll see you inside. Hello. Today for the video, we're going to be looking at a few different sections of chapter 3. Today specifically, what does the charter reflect about today's society compared to the past? That's the first section we're going to take a look at. So we're going to take a look at briefly some stories of where Canada in the past has decided to restrict people's rights, but now that we've got the charter in modern society, we should say we know better. So the first thing to say here is that we started off on very much the wrong foot when it came to some people's rights here in Canada. For instance, this quote from John A. Macdonald is a good indication of where our heads were at as a country as we really began this country. When the school is on the reserve, the child lives with its parents who are savages. And though he may learn to read and write, his habits and training and mode of thought are Indian. He is simply a savage who can read and write. Very discriminatory, very much against the idea of integrating or accepting Aboriginal peoples into our society. Rather, he's seeing them as savages, which leads us into one of the first bits of legislation that we really start to talk about in class, which is the Indian Act. It was passed in 1876, and we will be talking about it more in class later. So we're not going to say everything we need to say about it now. It's more of like an introduction. But the Indian Act in 1876 affected those First Nations who conducted treaties with the government. So right now, for instance, I'm recording this on Treaty 6 territory. This would be the First Nations with whom Treaty 6 is with. And so the Indian Act would apply to those people. This is not referring to Métis or Inuit who had different agreements and different situations with the Canadian government through the years. So we're just talking about treaty folks. This was, of course, passed without any kind of consultation with the First Nation people. And what it did is it restricted their rights in all kinds of things. For instance, they had to get government permission to wear traditional clothing. It banned traditional ceremonies. It prevented First Nation from taking any kind of political action. And so you can find a bunch more stuff about this if you have the book. You can look on page 137, but we will be talking about it in upcoming chapters as well. But this is one of the first things where we legitimately stepped out to restrict people's rights. Now, this is long before the charter, but the reason we're mentioning it now is that we would not hopefully pass legislation that restricts people's rights in these kind of ways. We will say that the Indian Act is still on the books. It has been modified since its original passing, so there are some changes to it, which we, again, will talk about later. So some of these things on this slide are not all in place anymore, but you know, it still is on the books in general. It's something to know about. I mean, there's some pictures you might have seen from residential schools where we took the Indian Act and basically put it into practice with different residential schools trying to essentially assimilate and create genocide for First Nation peoples. Another group that we can talk about limiting their rights is women. And just to mention briefly that women, you know, were barred from voting until 1918 by the Canadian Election Act. They started their fight a long time before that, about 40 years or so before that, in 1876, 45 years or so. They had organizations that they would gather as suffragettes to try to sway people that women should have the right to vote. such as the Toronto Women's Literary Club was created. Emily Howard Stowe was one of the organizers of these marches and these groups that would get together, and they would have rallies. They would hold marches in the streets. They would try to campaign for their right to get the vote, which again they get in 1918. Emily Murphy says at one point, "I believe there never was a country better adapted to produce a great race of women than this Canada of ours, nor a race of women better adapted to make a great country." So I think it's a great quote because it shows both ways, that both Canada is set up in the perfect the conditions exist perfectly for Canada to be a place where women can really advance. And the women in that generation at that time are such that they are going to really be able to help out Canada. And so the both working together are uniquely situated to make Canada a wonderful place. And that's what she believed, in thinking that women, could get the right to vote. They'd be able to help progress Canada forward. We also have a few other examples. I'm just going to briefly go through some of these. You can read the slides on your own. You can read them in the book and things like that. But there are a few cases where we would take different people during wartime and lock them up and keep them away from everybody else. We have internment of a bunch of different people. First that we'll talk about is Ukrainian Canadians. About 8,000 of them of Ukrainian and German descent, kept arrested and detained in these camps in 1914 during World War I. We were able to make these arrests under the War Measures Act, and that War Measures Act is the important thing here that you need to remember and come up with if you need it later, because it is the act that allows us to do everything we need to do in order to win the war. So in other words, we could take any measures necessary in order to win the war. And the War Measures Act allows us broad ability to even limit people's rights at times. And that's how we were able to make these arrests. We would take people's homes, possessions. Mostly they were just men we took, but we did take some families. They had to work as laborers. They built roads, they built parks. Certain places in Jasper and Banff, if you go there, you can see monuments and areas where the internment camps were. Even after the War Measures Act finished after World War I, we still kept some in camps, and in 2005 we issued an apology for that because we realized, of course, we had made a big mistake, and now we had the charter. We also did this with Italian Canadians during World War II. We used the War Measures Act again. There it is again. And we've arrested people of Italian descent. We sent them to camps. We began this in about 1940. About 700 people, mostly men, but some families as well. And in 1990, we apologized to the Italian Canadians for this. And then the last group to talk about is Japanese Canadians, which after 1941 in Pearl Harbor, when Pearl Harbor was bombed by the Japanese in the United States, Japan and then Canada and U.S. were now at war. So we held Japanese Canadians under very deep suspicion, even if they were raised in Canada. We just thought if they were Japanese, we were going to, they were suspects. So what we did is we decided to move all of these Japanese Canadians away from the West Coast, Japanese Canadians, I should say. We moved them away from the West Coast into the interior of BC. Again, the War Measures Act allows us to do that. About 20,000 men, women, and children in this case, whole families. We sold off their homes. We sold off their businesses. We sold their possessions, kept the money. And in 1988, we formally apologized to Japanese Canadians for this clear violation of their rights. The United States also had Japanese internment camps as well as other internment camps. So Canada wasn't alone in doing this, but we recognized our mistake and we did apologize for it later. This is just a little map of where the internment camps were, at least some of them. You can maybe pause the video if you want and take a look at where they are, but you'll notice out in Alberta here, there's a whole bunch in that Banff and Jasper area indicated by this part of the map right here that's blown up, okay? So if you've ever been out to Jasper or Banff, you've probably driven by some of these places. This is what some of them would look like. Some monuments, you can see their shacks, houses out in the mountains. Going to be very difficult living out there. All right, and then the last section of the chapter, just to briefly go over, is that the Charter doesn't just affect us in these kind of ways that protect our rights, but it also helps us with protection of rights when we make laws, and then also in the workplace. And those are the last two bits that we'll talk about today. In the book, and there's a lot of stuff in the book that you can read here, but in the book, there's this story of Robin Eldridge, John and Linda Warren. It's on page 105. And this is a case where some people who were deaf could not, speak. And they had, like in one case, the baby was, when they had a baby, it was whisked away into another room and they didn't know what was going on. Well, they sued the government because they said their rights were being violated because, they said basically that they were discriminated against because of their disability in this case. And it went all the way to Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court found that they were right. Their rights were discriminated against. And so we have to make sure that we do not discriminate in any way based on people's ability, for instance, to speak. And this could go to other things, people's ability to hear, people's ability to walk. And these are why we try to make places that are accessible, places that are able to be accessed by multiple people in multiple ways. On page 106, there's a story about the Lord's Day Act, which made it illegal for Canadian businesses, most Canadian businesses, to be open on Sundays. And the Big M Drug Mart in Calgary challenged that after the charter was in place. It said, we're going to stay open. And they got in trouble for it. So when they went to court, they said, hey, look how wrong this law is. And basically, they participated in a bit of civil disobedience, where you break the law to prove a point, which is what it says here. They deliberately broke the law to make a point. This is also what people fighting for civil rights often do. They'll break the law knowing they're breaking the law, but they're doing it to make a certain point, the fact that the law that they're breaking is an illegal law and that it's an immoral law and that it should be changed. So we can sue the government, as the first story is. We can break the law to make a point in the second law. There's also some other examples dealing with the no-fly list and other issues going on in Canadian society that you should be aware of on page 107, 108, and 109. You should be able to take a look at those and read those, find out what's going on. As a summary, though, for this section, again, we can change the law by suing the government. We can break the law in order to change the law. And there are some laws, like the no-fly list that you'll read about, that just challenge our idea of how far the charter should go. How much should our rights be respected, yet how far should we be able to be secure, free from, let's say, terrorism in this case. In class, you might want to debate this and talk about, our rights versus security. Sometimes we want to be secure, but we also want to give people rights. Where's that line between the two, and how far do we go? Should we go ahead and always look for vulnerable people and pass a law that makes sure they're protected? Or does a charter already protect them, and we just have to make sure that we're aware of their protections? Some things to talk about in class. The last little bit is how the charter affects the workplace, and then we'll be done with this chapter. And again, these are kind of just short little things for you to think about and read more on in the book. In terms of discrimination in the workplace, the first thing to say is the fact that these things called labor unions exist. Labor unions are organization of workers that act to protect workers' rights and interests. There's a story about this on page 231. So for instance, in one case, we had pay that was unequal, women getting paid differently than men. And a labor union would be able to bring this concern. A labor union is good because it's a group of people that all work in the same industry, who all band together basically to fight for their rights. When one person goes to their boss and says, I don't like this, you're giving me too many hours, you're being unfair to me, they can just get fired. But a labor union can basically represent all the workers and be able to go to that employer and say, you need to change the contract, you need to make sure we have equal pay, many things like this. Many of your families have probably people in your family that are in unions. Teachers are in unions, and steel workers and welders, doctors, nurses, all kinds of unions out there to represent the rights for people and make sure people are protected and that they can fight for kind of the little guy is the idea. And then another one is discrimination based on age. In the 90s, at the U of A, they used to force people into retirement. And that was challenged, saying, I can still do my job. Just because I'm 60 years old doesn't mean you have to fire me. I can still do my job well. I'm successful. You know, there's no reason that my age is hurting my ability to do my job. Therefore, it is illegal under equality rights to fire me, to force me to retire just because I'm old. It's discrimination based on age. And that was seen to be true, and we can't do that. Okay? So essentially, that is it. I know that second part of the chapter is fast. There's a lot of different little stories, but the idea is that the Charter protects us in many ways. The first video that you watched was all about individual rights and how we were protected from those individual rights. And then this video is all about the stories, the many, many stories out there about how the Charter has protected people, how our understanding of people's rights has changed, how we are as a society hopefully growing more just and more equitable because the Charter's there to help guide us in the right direction. Will we get it wrong? Yes. Will we make mistakes? You bet. But hopefully the Charter is there to kind of guide us into the right direction, and that's what we're hoping for. So thanks a lot. That's the end of chapter 3. We're going to then look at chapter 4 next, which is all about collective rights. We're still in the Charter. We're just focusing on different types of rights for that one. Thanks so much, and we will see you next time.